Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Off the Cuff, and this is episode number 2. And if you're tuning in, this is recorded on the 28th of February, and I'm not sure what I'm telling you guys this, but hey, happy end of February. So today I want to talk about the fact that does it matter whether a watch brand makes watches using in-house movements or third-party movements, and I suppose it's really to talk about the significance between the two types of movements that's out there on the market. And I think I want to first describe and give a definition, right, between what is an in-house watch movement and a third-party watch movement. So in-house movement refers to when a brand develops their own movements, for example, a simple freehander or perhaps with a date complication. So this set of movement used by the brand is developed in-house by the brand itself. So Tudor has their own in-house movements. Rolex obviously uses their own in-house movement as well. Cartier, I think to the most extent, they use their own in-house movement. JLC uses their own movement. So those are examples of in-house movements, or rather brands that utilize in-house movements. And I think next up we have the third-party movements. So those are things like your Sellita, those are your ETAs, those are your Miyotas, those are your Seiko, NH I think 35, 36. So those are third-party movements that are very commonly found in different watches out there, mostly on the lower tier, but also in mid-luxury section, which I'll talk about in just a bit. So to me, after obviously defining what these in-house movements and third-party movements are, I'm quite sure this problem is actually quite unique to watch enthusiasts, and only to watch enthusiasts. And which is caring whether a watch comes with an in-house movement or a third-party movement. If I were to guess, if anyone were to walk into a boutique, look at watches, they'll probably select something within their price range, and they'll probably select something that they like visually and it wears well on the wrist. Stylistically, I think that is more of an important aspect. So that is just my two cents on this topic. And this topic is not something that I myself particularly cared about when I first got into watches. I was told by my AD that my first watch, the Black Bay Heritage, was 41mm across, had 70 hours of power reserve, and was COSC certified for accuracy. So that was really all that I really cared about the watch for. The part where he was mentioning that it was in-house movement, it really mattered like next to zero to me, right? It really didn't matter to me at all. So at that point, I was still trying to differentiate between the terms mechanical and automatic, which now I know. So the type of movement that it had, whether it be an in-house movement or third-party movement, it really meant very little to me. And I think as I continue my watch journey and learn a bit more about movements and manufacturers and brand history, it stopped being an afterthought and it became a criteria for me to when it came down to my next watch purchase. And I thought to myself, in-house must be better than third-party, right? After all, brands have taken the time to develop and the effort to develop the movement for specific watch models. And that was also primarily a reason why it took me so long to own my IWC Mark 18, because inside the Mark 18, it's in-house. It's not an in-house movement; it's a Sellita movement or an ETA movement. So obviously, this begs the actual question within today's episode: is in-house movement inherently better than the more mainstream third-party movements like ETA or Sellita? And I think this actually depends on a whole different sets of a whole lot of different considerations, and it depends on primarily what matters to you as a watch collector. Chances are, if you are listening to me talking about movements for 4 to 5 minutes, you do care about the movement, or at the very least you want to know whether it truly makes a difference or not. And this is where I'm gonna give my 2 cents. So generally speaking, the pros of going with the in-house movement, and in contrast, this would mean to say that there is a con for a third-party movement, is the fact that in-house movements are generally way superior in power reserve, period. Generally speaking, Tudor uses a lot of these in-house developed movements in their flagship dive watches, like I mentioned before, the Black Bay line, and they boast about 70 hours of power reserve. And this is a massive bonus for someone who already has a couple of watches that they need to keep wound up over the weekend, for example, or they would like to have change out the watches over the week or even within the day itself. So it's a massive plus for people like them, myself included, right? So that I can have my watch still ticking and keeping good time when I do pick it up again. At the same time, taking an example of a chronograph, right? A standard chronograph is generally quite likely to have a module installed on top of the general watch movement, so an ETA movement with a chronograph module placed on top of it to create the chronograph itself. The problem it creates is that it would be a lot thicker because you're actually putting something on top of your standard watch movement to create the chronograph function. Zenith has developed obviously the first integrated automatic movement for chronographs, which eliminates the need for a modular installation, which obviously means to say that the watch itself is a lot thinner when it's contrast with a modular chronograph out there in the market. So if you were to take a look at Hamilton's chronograph, it's 100% a modular chronograph versus what you have for the Zenith Elf Primero, for example. You can see the stark difference when it comes down to the thickness of the watch. So it allows for the watch to be built a lot more wearable, in my opinion, in a sense. And lastly, I think perhaps knowing a substantial part of the cost that you pay for, has gone to the engine of the watch, may be a plus to some watch collectors, or maybe if the movement itself is, in-house movement is a historically significant one. So that's also worth the collector's, time and effort and money to really specifically go in for the in-house movement itself. So on the other hand, I think the pros of going with a third-party movement group generally, first of all, be the fact that it's relatively easily serviceable by any watchmaker in theory. And that's because ETA, Sellita, they have been around for the longest time. So a lot of watchmakers are generally trained to work on these movements. And at the same time, because it's so mainstream, it's so common and it has such a great history around it. So generally speaking, it really doesn't matter, if you were to be in a foreign land and you require servicing of your watch itself, generally speaking, anyone who's competent should be good enough to make it work again. At the same time, I think third-party movements are equally as capable, if not in certain cases potentially more capable if regulated properly to specs. And these movements are normally tried and tested for the past couple of decades, right? ET had been making movements for the longest time, and in certain cases, these third-party movements, right? They are better actually. They're more robust because in certain cases, in-house movements that are newly developed, they might face even growing pains after its release. So for example, Tudor's GMT movement problems, they actually faced, I think it was a date wheel having issues when it comes down to the rotation itself, and early Omega coaxial movements, which technically they were built on ETA movements, but it's new technology nonetheless. So it may tarnish the brand's reputation, and also it might bring a really poor user experience, if that makes sense. No one wants to buy a watch, spend a couple of $1,000s, buy a watch, and have it sent back to the watchmaker, the watch brand, for the next 3 months trying to sort out a movement issue. No one wants that, right? At the same time, I think using third-party movement allows watch brands to roll out more affordable watches and perhaps allow the brand to spend more money elsewhere. For example, in case finishing, dial finishing, or maybe certain aspects of the watch. So I don't see the usage of third-party movement as anything that should be shunned away from or shy away from. Third-party movement also allows the enablement of micro brands' existence, because otherwise you cannot have a startup shelling out millions of dollars to develop their own movement at mass before they even can run their own watch business. So understandably, I think after a certain price point, it may be difficult to justify the use of third-party movement, but I think it also boils down to what type of third-party movement you're going to be using in a specific watch. For example, if you're going to be using a Miyota watch movement, which generally I think it only costs $5 to $10 if I'm not mistaken, I suppose. In a Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, for example, right? I think that is never gonna cut it. But at the same time, Royal Oak and Audemars Piguet, they famously had been using third-party movement from JLC, and JLC has been supplying these watch movements to a lot of different watch brands out there, like Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, and also obviously Audemars Piguet for the longest time. So the usage of third-party movement had been well documented, and it had been very widespread until recent years. It became a bit of a marketing ruse for watch brands to say that, hey, you know what? I have developed my own technology, I have developed my own movements, and now I'm better than the rest that doesn't have it. And I think it's a bit of a shame to look at it this way, because if it's gonna be a standard three-hander watch, if it's gonna be a standard just a time only or date only kind of function, I do not see any significant benefits besides the power reserve that the in-house movement would provide that a third-party movement would not. Now, granted, if a brand wants to flex its horological muscle and create things like your perpetual calendar or things like your tourbillon or whatever else out there and around that is hot horology, like IWC, right? If IWC can create these kind of pieces, you jolly well know that they can make a damn good three-hander watch, a simple three-hander watch. They can regulate it properly, they can make it work properly, right? So I think unless you do care about the pedigree or the expertise of the degree of craftsmanship in technology and in movement that a specific brand will bring, I would argue that in-house movement is probably going to be a lot more important than non-in-house movement, third-party movements. But if you were to consider that at the end of the day, you will probably, and it's not probably actually, sorry, you will be getting the same amount of warranty if you were to buy an IWC Mark 18 with a Sellita movement versus if you were to buy an in-house movement IWC, you'll be getting exact same type of warranty, so it doesn't speak too much about the difference in robustness and the likes of it. So to wrap it up, in my opinion, I think there is a specific acceptable range of movements that can be used in specific price points. Now, once again, the example with a Miyota movement in a Audemars Piguet, obviously that is never going to fly. But third-party movements are inherently not evil or not inferior. If anything, the likes of JLC creating third-party movements for the Holy Trinity should give us a lot of confidence in that. And the reason why third-party movements get a bit of a bad rap is because of, in my opinion, marketing in general. And obviously, I think there are certain third-party movements that are not finished or not done properly and they are of the cheaper variant, and that's fine. There are also a ton of in-house movement that did not do as well as they could have done at the very beginning. So I think being able to understand this and appreciate this, and depending once again on how much emphasis that you place on the engine itself, on the movement itself, is gonna make a world of difference looking at this topic itself. I, for one, at this point in time, I'm never gonna spend, or rather at this point in time, I'm not gonna be spending more than $15,000 on the watch at this point in time. So whether it's going to be in-house movement or not, I don't really give too much of thought so far. I used to think that ETA movement watches are just unacceptable, but right now it's keeping the same time, right? But when I do purchase a watch over a specific threshold, it becomes a different topic. It becomes a topic of I'm owning something that had conscious development and conscious thought put behind it, and that's why I'm paying a specific premium or price for this specific product. What do you guys think? This is my thoughts on whether in-house movements or third-party movements, whether there should be even this conversation to begin with. But let me know your thoughts, let me know what you guys think, and as always, thank you very much for tuning in, and until next time, peace out.